Take a clay pot and put cooked pork in it. Pour warm melted fat over the meat until every piece disappears under it. Let the fat go hard. Then carry the pot down to a cool cellar and leave it. 6 months through a European winter. No salt curing, no smoke, no ice, no lid worth the name. When you dig the fat out in spring, the meat is still good. Farm kitchens across Europe did this for centuries, and versions of it still sit on restaurant menus in France today. Which should bother you, because fat is not a preservative. It has no salt in it, it kills nothing, and butter left on your counter goes rancid in a week. So something else in that pot was doing the work. Tonight we find out what the fat actually does, what it absolutely does not do, and the one step that decides whether the pot feeds your family or poisons them. Start with the suspect everyone names first, because most explanations of this method stop at the wrong answer. The fat, people say, keeps the air out, and without air, nothing can rot. That is half true and dangerously incomplete. And to see why, you have to know what was actually happening in a medieval household in November. The killing month had a name in nearly every European language. In Old English, it was Blodmonnath, the blood month, the point in the year when the animals came in from grazing and the family decided which ones would not be fed through winter. Slaughter came once a year as an event, and it produced a crisis. One pig gave a family 100 pounds of meat in a single afternoon, and no way to eat it before it spoiled. Salt was the standard answer, but salt was money. It was taxed, traded, and hauled inland from coastal pans or mined works, and a poor household rationed it the way you would ration medicine. There was never enough salt for a whole animal. And here the other half of the pig's gift matters. That same animal had given up 30 or 40 pounds of hardback fat and leaf fat, rendered down in the kitchen into a clean white lard that cost the family nothing at all. Every household had a surplus of exactly the material that would go on to keep the meat. That is the accident at the centre of this story. The preservation medium was free, and it arrived on the same day as the problem. Rendering it was a whole day's work in its own right. The hard fat was cut small and set over a low fire with a little water, and then it simply had to be watched for hours while the water cooked off and the fat ran clear. Rush it, and the whole batch scorched and tasted of it forever. Do it properly, and you poured off something almost pure white when it cooled, keeping for months on its own, with the crisp browned bits left in the pot as a bonus nobody wasted. A medieval kitchen did not throw away one usable ounce of an animal, and in that kitchen's accounting, the fat ranked as one of the main harvests of the slaughter alongside the meat itself. So what did they do with it? Across Europe, the same basic technique appears with a dozen local names. In France, the ducks and geese were salted lightly, then cooked slowly submerged in their own fat and stored in crocks under a fat cap, which is confit, and the shredded pork version is rillettes. In England and Scotland, it was potted meat, cooked, pounded, packed into a pot, and sealed under clarified butter. Germany had Schmalzfleisch and its cousin Griebenschmalz. Poland and Ukraine kept Smalek. Even the travelling version existed. Pemmican in North America and comparable field rations in Europe worked on the same idea: dried protein bound in melted fat. The technique was invented independently again and again because the same two facts held everywhere. Meat spoils. Rendered fat is free. The details differ in ways that tell you what each kitchen was short of. The French versions lean on the animal's own fat and treat the crock as a stage in cooking. The English potted meats often used butter, clarified first so the milk solids that would sour were skimmed away and were pounded fine with mace or nutmeg because the spice trade had reached that kitchen. The Eastern European versions kept the crisp rendered bits in the fat and spread the whole thing on bread as a meal in itself. Same physics, 4 cuisines, and none of them borrowed it from the others. Now the question that runs the rest of this video: why does it work? Not the folk answer, the real mechanism, because the folk answer will get somebody sick, and the fastest way to find it is to rule out what fat cannot do. First suspect cold. It is easy to assume a heavy fat cap keeps the meat cool, the way a thick wall does. Fat does hold temperature reasonably well, but it generates nothing and refrigerates nothing. Put a fat-sealed crock in a warm kitchen and it warms up to the temperature of that kitchen within the day. Every historical account of this method comes with a cellar, a larder, a north-facing pantry, a spring house. That is not incidental scenery. A stone cellar dug into the ground sits close to the local groundwater temperature all year, somewhere in the region of 50 degrees in much of Europe, and holds it while the world above swings from frost to heat. The crock was always in a cold room. The fat never replaced cold storage. It rode along with it. Cross cold off, or rather, note that it belongs to the room, not the pot. Second suspect, and this is the important one, antimicrobial action. Honey earns that title honestly, and this channel has covered why. Honey pulls water out of bacteria by sheer sugar concentration, and its own enzymes generate a slow trickle of hydrogen peroxide, so honey attacks the things that would spoil meat. Fat does none of that. Lard is chemically boring. It leaves the water in a bacterial cell exactly where it found it, produces no antiseptic, carries no acid worth mentioning, and bacteria are perfectly happy to live in food that is greasy. Left in warm light and open air, fat itself degrades, going rancid as oxygen breaks its molecules apart, which is the opposite of a preservative doing its job. Whatever protects the meat in that crock, the fat is not fighting for it. Cross antimicrobial action off entirely. Third suspect, salt. Traditional recipes do use some. A light salting before cooking, sometimes a rub left overnight, and it matters, which we will come back to, because it turns out to matter enormously. But the quantities are a fraction of what a salt cure needs. A true salt-cured ham sits buried in salt for weeks and comes out transformed, dry and hard and inedible until soaked. Potted meat is soft, mild and spoonable. It was never salt preserved. Cross salt off as the main mechanism and keep it in your pocket as an accomplice. So the fat does not chill the meat, does not kill anything, and is not a cure. 3 suspects gone, and the pot still keeps for 6 months. What the fat actually does is simpler and more mechanical than any of that. It is a gasket. Poured warm liquid fat flows into every gap between the pieces of meat, wets every surface, and pushes the air out ahead of itself. Then it solidifies, and now the meat is not in a room with air in it. It is embedded in a solid, water-repelling block. Mold spores drifting through the cellar cannot land on the meat, they land on fat. Oxygen cannot reach it to turn the meat's own fats rancid. The meat's moisture cannot evaporate out, so it does not go dry and grey. Fat does not attack spoilage. It builds a wall and then stands there, which is why a broken fat cap ruins a crock. Any crack, any pocket of trapped air, any place where a piece of meat pokes through the surface and mould blooms on that spot alone, while the meat 2 inches away stays perfect. Cooks knew this, which is why the instructions in old kitchen books nag so hard about pressing the meat down, pouring the fat warm rather than hot, and topping the crock up with a fresh layer after each time you dig into it. But a gasket only protects against what comes from outside. And that raises the question the folk answer never asks. What about what was already in there? Because sealing food away from air is not automatically safe. Turns out it is a decision with a shadow, and the shadow is the whole reason this method has rules. Cutting off oxygen defeats mold and most common spoilage bacteria, the noisy ones that announce themselves by smell and slime and save you from yourself. Remove them, and you have also removed the warning system. What is left is an environment a much quieter organism prefers. Clostridium botulinum lives in soil and dust nearly everywhere. It cannot grow where there is air. It thrives in a sealed, low-acid, low-salt, warm environment, which is a fair description of a fat-sealed pot of meat left somewhere warm, and it produces one of the most powerful toxins known. This is not a modern anxiety projected backwards. The disease got its name from Latin for sausage, botulus, because German physicians in the early 1800s traced a cluster of paralytic deaths to sealed sausages. The doctor who described it properly, Justinus Kerner, was a country physician in Württemberg who collected case after case through the 1820s, and what he was staring at was exactly this class of food, cooked meat packed tight and sealed away from air by a farm kitchen doing what its grandmother did. He worked out that the poison was produced in the food itself rather than carried into it, and he was close enough to the truth to suggest the substance might one day be used as a medicine, which, 2 centuries later, it is. It took until the 1890s for a Belgian scientist to isolate the organism after another outbreak, this one from salted ham served at a funeral, which means the folk explanation has it backwards. Sealing the meat under fat was not the safety step. Sealing the meat was the risk, taken on purpose, and the safety was built in before the fat ever hit the pot. That is the answer to the question this video opened with, and everything the old kitchens actually did lines up behind it. Look at what happens before the seal. The meat is cooked, and cooked long, submerged in fat at a temperature that holds for hours, which kills the living bacteria present in the meat. It is salted lightly, but salt is precisely what makes a low-oxygen environment hostile to the organism we just named. It goes into a scalded pot, poured with fat hot enough to sterilize the surfaces it touches. And then, the part no farm kitchen ever skipped, it goes somewhere cold, and it gets eaten within months rather than kept for years, because a cool cellar suppresses growth that a warm pantry would permit. Cook, salt, seal, chill, eat by spring. Every one of those 5 steps is doing real work, and the fat is only the third of them. The traditions that survived are the ones that kept all 5. That is not folklore. That is a hazard control system arrived at by trial, error, and funerals, and passed down as a recipe because nobody had the vocabulary for anything else. And the honest part of this is that the method is still on the table today if you want it. If you want to make this history instead of only watching it, that is what the Medieval Way store is for. The Medieval Bakery Collection is where it starts. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the dishes themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own, the way these kitchens did. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. It is all over at the Medieval Way store. Meanwhile, there is one more thing the fat was quietly doing to the meat inside that pot, and it has nothing to do with safety at all. Fat is a solvent, in the plain chemical sense, and a great many of the compounds we experience as flavour and aroma dissolve in fat rather than in water. Cook a duck leg submerged in fat for hours, and the fat pulls flavour out of the meat and holds it. And every day the sealed crock sits in the cellar, that exchange goes on quietly in both directions. Collagen, the tough connective tissue that makes cheap cuts chewy, has already broken down into gelatin during the long low cooking, so the meat pulls apart under a fork. Nothing dries out because nothing can evaporate. Cooks noticed that confit tasted better after a month in the pot than it did the day it was made, and treated the waiting period as part of the recipe rather than as storage. Rillettes make the same point in a different direction. The whole dish is cheap pork cooked to collapse, shredded, and beaten back together with enough of its own fat to spread like butter, and it is one of the great things a French kitchen produces. It began as a way to use the parts of the pig that nobody wanted to be seen eating. And no, that is not nostalgia talking. This is the reason the technique outlived its own purpose. Refrigeration arrived, the preservation problem vanished, and confit and rillettes stayed on French menus anyway, because at some point the emergency measure had turned into one of the best things you could do to a piece of pork. There is also a lesson buried in the pot that went much further than any farm kitchen. Look at the logic again. Cook the food thoroughly, then seal it away from air, then keep it cool, and it lasts far beyond its natural life. In the 1790s, a Parisian confectioner named Nicolas Appert began testing that same sequence systematically, cooking food and sealing it in glass jars, and in 1810 he published the method and took a prize from the French government for it. Within the year, an Englishman had patented the same principle in tin, and the canning industry was born, an industry that would feed armies, supply ships, and reshape what a household could keep in a cupboard. The seal was no longer fat, it was glass and metal. And note what Appert did not know. Pasteur's work on microbes was still half a century away, so Appert could not say why his jars kept, any more than a farm wife could say why her crock did. He had a reliable sequence and no theory, which is precisely the position every kitchen in this video was in. The principle was identical, and the peasant crock had gotten there first by centuries. Every can in your kitchen is running the medieval fat cap with better hardware. So what happens when you actually do it today? The technique is genuinely accessible, and it is worth being straight about both halves of that. The traditional version goes like this. Salt the meat, a fatty cut like pork shoulder or duck leg, and leave it overnight in the refrigerator. Rinse it, dry it, and cook it slowly and completely submerged in melted lard or duck fat at a low temperature for several hours until a fork goes through with no resistance. Pack the hot meat into a scalded jar, press out the air pockets, and strain the warm fat over the top until the meat is covered by a finger's width, with no piece breaking the surface. Let it set. Then, and this is where you part company with the medieval cellar, put it in your refrigerator. The medieval version accepted a level of risk that killed people, and modern food safety guidance is direct about it. Do not store this at room temperature. Do not treat the fat cap as a substitute for cold, and if a crock ever smells wrong, bulges, or has been left warm, throw it out without tasting it. Bacterial toxins are not something you can taste your way around. Kept cold and eaten within a few weeks, this is a real and delicious piece of historical cooking. Kept on a shelf because a video said medieval peasants did it, it is a gamble with the worst possible losing outcome. That is the honest ledger. The medieval household was not being reckless. It was choosing between a known risk and a hungry march, and it managed that risk with the only tools it had, salt it could barely afford, a cellar, a hot fire, and the discipline to finish the pot before spring. We have a refrigerator. Using it honours the tradition rather than breaking it, because it makes the same trade the tradition always made, with one more tool on the table. Go back to the crock in the cellar, 6 months in, the fat gone hard and white on top. That white cap is not protecting the meat the way the stories say. It is a lid, nothing more, and everything that made the meat safe happened in a hot kitchen months before it ever went on. The preservation was never in the pot. It was in the sequence. We dig up the food knowledge the modern kitchen forgot. Subscribe for more. Would you try this, or does sealed meat in a cellar sound like a step too far?